The Athenians crowded behind the city walls. Confident in their vision of imperial power and glory, they assumed that Pericles' strategy could only bring them victory. But among this teeming multitude could be found one man who refused to assume anything. A man unique in Athenian society. A man called Sokratis.
If you were an ancient Athenian citizen, the first thing you'd see is a man who was unbelievably ugly. His head was too big, his eyes were too large, his nose was all the wrong shape. Socrates' appearance breaks every rule of classical Greek aesthetics, of the idea of proportion and measure.
Socrates walked the streets of Athens barefoot, clad only in a dirty robe. He cared nothing for appearance or any of the other conventions of his day. Socrates was interested only in the mind. This unlikely figure would become the leader of a revolution. A revolution in thinking that had been gathering strength across the Greek world. For thousands of years, mankind had assumed that the world around them, the sun, the stars, and the moon, were gods and spirits. Believing they were recording messages from their gods, ancient civilizations such as the Babylonians had gathered great catalogues of astronomical data. This detailed astronomical calendar from Babylon records the rising and falling of the constellations and the gods they represented. This knowledge and study of the heavens had been slowly spreading across the ancient world until it reached Greek colonies on the coast of what is modern-day Turkey. There, a shattering change occurred. For the Greeks took this astronomical knowledge and transformed it. They took the gods out of the heavens and replaced them with reason.
Gradually, the Greeks begin to say, these are not persons, these are things. There's an orderly world which the human mind can actually capture. It is subject to our understanding.
These Greeks began to calculate and predict the movement of the moon and stars through mathematics and logic, rather than using gods and spirits to explain everything. It was the birth of science. The first great Greek scientist, a man named Thales, wrote the earliest book on navigation and how to sail using the stars as a guide. And on a journey to Egypt, Thales was the first man to measure the height of the Great Pyramid.
Brilliant idea. He stood next to the pyramid until high noon, when his shadow was exactly the same length as his height. And at that point, he measured the shadow of the pyramid and accordingly knew the, the height of the pyramid, which is actually an application of a rather sophisticated geometrical theorem.
These Greek scientists would go on to measure the circumference of the world when most people still thought it was flat. To devise steam engines, water pumps, and suspension bridges. But Socrates was not interested in the mechanics of the physical world. He would use this new way of thinking, using reason and logic to study people.
The great change comes with Socrates, who turns his back, so to speak, to the world of nature. What he cares about is the individual. You become an object of study and care.
Socrates spent his days in conversation, walking the streets of Athens, talking and debating with anyone he met. With over 150,000 people now packed behind Athens' walls, he was in his element.
One of the amazing things about Socrates is that he is the first fanatical urban individual. He loves the city. He makes life in the city one of his major concerns.
Socrates' life was spent questioning the assumptions his fellow Athenians held about their lives. What they felt was right and wrong, what was good and bad. And he was happy to turn convention upside down. One of Socrates' followers recorded how, at the end of a drunken dinner party, Socrates proved to a fellow guest that he was in fact the better looking of the two.
My eyes must be more beautiful because they bulge out, and therefore I can see better. And by the same account, my nose is more beautiful because my nostrils flare out, and so I can therefore gather in more smells.
This is typical Socrates, using reason and logic to examine the world anew.
Socrates says you must make every decision based on your own understanding of what is good and what is not good, what is right and what is wrong.
For Socrates, this freedom of thought was paramount, even if it meant upsetting the whole notion of a beautiful nose.
I tell you, let no day pass without discussing all the things about which you hear me talking. A life without this sort of examination is not worth living.
But as Socrates spent his days in debate, his city was fighting a war. The Spartans invaded Athenian territory and set about burning all the farmland around the city. The Athenians became increasingly anxious. They could only watch from the city walls as their fields and crops were destroyed. But such was Pericles' reputation, he managed to convince the Athenians to stick with his plan. The city could rely on her fleet and shipments from overseas to survive. Little did Pericles know that this fleet now carried an even greater threat. One year into the war, the grain boats that fed the city brought with them an additional cargo: plague. A disease that would now devastate Athens.
Pericles' plan couldn't anticipate difficulties that we now would suggest were rather likely in those circumstances of crowding. And the results were horrendous.
With the population crammed behind the city walls, the affliction spread like wildfire. The symptoms were horrific. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived through these years, recorded its effects.
The body was suddenly seized, first with violent heats around the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes. And then the disease descended into the bowels, producing violent ulceration and uncontrollable diarrhea. The sufferings of individuals seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature.